Test 1 2 3. Test 1 2 3. And all right, well, good evening. Good evening to those of you here in the sanctuary, and good evening to folks who are watching us online right now on Wednesday evening. We're glad you could join us, whether it's in person or for those of you folks who are watching us on your computer or your phone or your television or whatever device you are watching. And whether you're watching us now on Wednesday night or later in the week or later in the month or in Oklahoma or anywhere else, we're glad you're a part of our study tonight. We are continuing to look at the life of David, one of the most fascinating characters and people in the Old Testament, an ancestor of Jesus, and somebody who plays such a prominent role in a big chunk of the Old Testament. This is our fourth week, and we've learned how David started out as a shepherd boy. The people had wanted a king. They'd asked the prophet and Judge Samuel to give him a king. He gave him a king. God allowed that. Saul turned out to not be a very good king. Good warrior, not a very good king. Didn't listen to God, didn't listen to the prophets. God said, we're going to replace him with David. David is brought into the household of the King Saul. David knows that he's been promised to be king someday, but he's not going to do anything about it. He kills Goliath. He becomes a mighty warrior. He becomes the son-in-law of the king. He becomes best friends with the king's son, Jonathan. But the people love David so much that Saul's jealousy begins to grow and fester. And we've been reading about how Saul's jealousy has reached the point of really madness, and how he has moments of clarity and where he realizes that his attempts on David's life are wrong. But most of the time, he is obsessed with getting rid of David because he sees David as a threat to his throne and the threat to the succession of his son Jonathan to the throne. So for the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at how David kept fleeing from Saul, and how Saul kept pursuing him, and how God kept protecting David. And so we're up to 1 Samuel 25. 1 Samuel 25. And we had ended where the last time in 24 was when Saul had gone, was hunting down David, had gone into a cave to relieve himself. David was already in that cave with his men. David could have slain Saul right then. He could have put a knife in his back easily. But David doesn't do that. Instead, David cut a piece of his robe off, a part of Saul's robe, and then later showed it to him and said, God put you into my hands and I didn't kill you. That proves I'm not after your throne. That proves I'm loyal. And Saul has a moment of clarity and says, you're right. You're more righteous than I am. And he gives up the hunt for a little while, but they both know this is not the end of the story. So now, chapter 25, that starts and says, now Samuel died. Remember, this is the book of 1 Samuel. Samuel is the star of this book for the first several chapters. Samuel, who's really the last of the judges and is also a prophet and really a priest. Samuel is the one who anointed Saul. He's the one who anointed David. He's the spokesperson for God, the one that Saul's been ignoring. But now he dies. And it says, Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. And then David moved down to the desert of Maon. Now here's where we meet an interesting character in this story. It says, a certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband, a Calebite, was surly and mean in his dealings. And before I go any further, I'm feeling a little echoey back there. I don't know if we changed anything, but anyway. So we meet a man named Nabal. Nabal in Hebrew means wilted, or sometimes is actually just translated as fool, which is, we're going to see, is an appropriate name for this fellow. His wife is Abigail, and we're told that he's a Calebite, which means he's descended from Caleb. Who was Caleb? Think about, where did we meet Caleb way back? We usually think of Caleb as being buddies with somebody else, with Joshua. If you remember the story of the spies who went in to the promised land when they were on the other side of the Jordan and they were about to cross over, and they sent 12 spies over. This is when Moses was still leading the people, and they said, let's send 12 spies over into the promised land. And if you remember, they sent 12 spies over, one from each tribe, and 10 of them came back and said, we can't do it, we can't conquer the land, people are too big, the cities are too well fortified, we're like grasshoppers compared to them, we can't do it. And only 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, said, if the Lord is with us, we can do it. And of course, Joshua then becomes eventually Moses' successor. But Caleb is the other good spy, the other one who believed that God's promises would be fulfilled. Of course, the people go with the minority report. The majority report. They don't believe Joshua and Caleb, and that's one of the reasons they wander for all those years. But the fact is, Caleb was one of the 12 spies, one spy from each tribe. Caleb was the spy from the tribe of Joshua. Okay. No, he wasn't. From Judah. The J word there. I'm mixing my people up. Caleb is the spy from the tribe of Judah. And that's significant because, remember, David is also from the tribe of Judah. So they're in the territory of Judah, which is David's home territory. And this man is a descendant of a particular family in the tribe of Judah, Caleb. And Caleb is a good guy in the Bible, but his descendant, Nabal, is, at least the Bible describes him as surly and mean. One of the other translations describes him as dog-like, because dogs in that culture, of course, were scavengers and not pets. And anyway, he's not a particularly good person here. And so we meet this rich, wealthy man and his wife, and it says, while David was in the desert, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear it's sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they'll tell you. Therefore, be favorable toward my young men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them.' And when David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name, and then they waited." Now, sheep shearing time. I'm not a sheep herder, but this is when they would shear the sheep to get the wool. And it wasn't simply a time of shearing. Sheep shearing was a festival time. It was a feast time. It was a celebratory time. It was a time in which you were expected to kind of throw parties and have big meals and festivities and celebrate. It was a festive time. The thing you also need to understand about the Middle East, and during this time, the time of David, 3,000 years ago, David, remember, lives about 1000 BC. So during this time, 3,000 years ago, and up to this time of our 21st century, hospitality is paramount. Hospitality is something that almost trumps everything else. When somebody comes to your house, comes to your land, comes to your town, if they're a stranger, unless they're a bandit or a hoodlum, you are expected to show hospitality. You're expected to feed the visitor. You're expected to house the visitor. Hospitality was paramount. Now, especially somebody like Nabal, who was a wealthy, wealthy man. And especially, we're to understand later that David's men had come in close proximity to Nabal's men. And David says, remind them that my men didn't take anything, they didn't steal anything, they didn't harass them. In fact, they protected them from raiders and bandits and everything else, that my men have been good to your men. So now, during this festival time, during this time of sheep shearing, and we're both from the tribe of Judah. I'm from Judah, you're from Judah. Can you give us some food? Can we participate in the festival? Can we eat? Can you give us some provisions? Now, any normal circumstance, somebody of David's reputation, somebody like David who has 600 men with him, somebody who is the king's son-in-law, somebody who slew Goliath, that any wealthy man would say, well, of course, let me feed your men. That would be the normal response. But that is not Nabal's response. It says, verse 10, Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I've slaughtered for my shears and give it to men coming from who knows where?" So he responds to David's entreaty with extreme rudeness. Basically, you and your men can all go to blazes, and I'm not giving you anything. And, who are you that I should give you anything? He responds in a very hostile way, a very non-hospitable way. So David's men returned to David. Verse 12, David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. And David said to his men, "Put on your swords." And you can see what's about to happen. David and his 600, David is personally offended at this slight, at this lack of hospitality, at this insult, and David is ready to go kill. And it says they put on their swords. David put on his. About 400 men went with him, with David, and 200 stayed behind with the supplies. Now, you might think, is this an overreaction? Well, in our culture, it probably would be an overreaction. In this culture, this is a huge insult to David. This is spitting in David's face. And David's response is, we will not take this insult. So one of the servants told Nabal's wife, Abigail, David sent messengers from the desert to give our master his greetings. This is one of the servants talking to Abigail. David sent messengers from the desert to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They didn't mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day they were a wall around us all the time that we were herding our sheep near them. In other words, they provided protection. Now, think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man, and no one can talk to him. So Nabal has now been described as surly, mean, wicked, and a man that nobody can talk to. He won't listen to anybody. And so the servants say to his wife, this is what he's done. He's insulted David, and this means big trouble. This is big, big trouble. So what does Abigail do? Verse 18, Abigail lost no time. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. And she told her servants, go on ahead, I'll follow you. But she didn't tell her husband, Nabal. She loads up as much food as she can get as quickly as she can and heads towards where David and his men are coming, sword in hand, to attack them. As she came riding her donkey on a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending towards her, and she met them. David had just said, it's been useless. All my watching over this fellow's property in the desert so that nothing of his was missing, he's paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. So David is going there to kill every single man in that household. Nabal, all of his sons, all of his male servants. David is going there to kill everybody, every man there is. Abigail saw David. She quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, my Lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. May my Lord pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He's just like his name. His name is Fool, and folly goes with him. But as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my master sent. And when she says my master, she's not talking about her husband. She's talking about David. She's calling David her master. Now, since the Lord has kept you, my master, from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, may your enemies and all who intend to harm my master be like Nabal. And let this gift which your servant has brought to my master be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's offense, for the Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my master, because he fights the Lord's battles. Let no wrongdoing be found in you as long as you live, even though someone is pursuing you to take your life. The life of my master will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has done for my master every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him leader over Israel, my master will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord has brought my master success, remember your servant. So notice what Abigail does here. She is doing what we would call damage control. She knows that her husband, who she says his name means fool and he is well named, her husband has basically created a situation where they are all going to die, that David is going to come and wipe them out with his men. And she knows she has to take matters into her own hands. So not only does she bring the food that was first asked for, she brings all the food she can gather up in short notice, But when she sees David, she gets down, puts her forehead on the ground, bows before David, calls David her master, apologizes and said, blame me. If you're going to blame somebody, blame me. She disses her own husband. She tells David that she knows that he's going to be king someday. She tells David she knows that all of his enemies are going to fall because God is with him. And she says, I know you will be glad that you did not kill people in haste, because your conscience would bother you if you took this vengeance on my household. I'm saving you for doing something rash that you would regret later. And then she says, and when you come into power, please remember me. So this is her attempt to stave off the slaughter that she knows that her husband has created. And here's David's response. David said to Abigail, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who's kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak. If you hadn't come, they'd all be dead by morning. Then David accepted from her hand what she'd brought and said, go home in peace. I've heard your words and granted your request. So she saves her household. She saves her husband. She saves all of the sons and men and servants. So when Abigail goes back home, verse 36, when Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. Again, what a guy. So she told him nothing until daybreak. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things. In other words, she said, this is what happened, and this is what's about to happen, and David is about to come kill you. And she told him everything. And his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. So his heart became like a stone. In other words, he had a heart attack or a stroke or something when she said, basically, you were this close to death. You were just this close to being murdered last night. When he heard what had happened, he apparently had a heart attack and lingered on for 10 days and then died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He's kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head. Notice he says he's kept me from doing wrong. David realizes that if he were to go in there and slaughter everybody, that would have been an overreaction, and he would have regretted it later. So he says, God has saved me from doing something rash, but God has also shown that this man who insulted me has paid for his insults, and by striking him dead, because David says, well, if he had their heart attack, that was God. Then, we're not quite done with this family. Then David sent word to Abigail asking her to become his wife. He asked the widow to come and be his wife. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife. She bowed down with her face to the ground and said, here is your maidservant, ready to serve you and wash the feet of my master's servants. Abigail quickly got on a donkey and, attended by her 5 maids, went with David's messengers and became his wife. So, not much mourning period there. But remember, you might say, well, how did Abigail, who is such an intelligent, skillful, diplomatic, quick-thinking woman, end up with a fool? Well, remember, she didn't pick him. Her parents picked him. Remember, marriages are all arranged. She didn't have any choice in who she married. Her parents said, she's marrying a really wealthy man. Nabal was a wealthy man, and they thought, this is a great match. But he was a wealthy fool. And she knew it. And so now she becomes one of David's wives. Verse 43, David had also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they both were his wives. But Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Paltiel, son of Lish, who was from Galim. So remember, David was married to Saul's daughter, Michal, who loved David. Remember, way back a couple of weeks ago, Saul had said, anyone who can kill Goliath can have my daughter. And, David had said, well, who am I, to marry the king's daughter? And so Saul married his oldest daughter off to somebody else. It said, but Michal loved David. And then Saul said, well, if you bring me the foreskins of 100 Philistines, you can have Michal. And remember, David brought Saul 200 foreskins of 200 Philistines, and he married Michal, and Michal loved David. But now that David is an outlaw, at least in Saul's mind, David's on the run, Saul has taken his daughter Michal, who's married to David, and given her to another man. So one more thing that Saul has done to show his contempt for his now former son-in-law. So the struggle between Saul and David goes on. Now into the next chapter. The Ziphites, verse chapter 26, the Ziphites went to Saul at Gibeah and said, is not David hiding on the hill of Hachilah, which faces Jessamon? So in other words, they're ratting David out. They're telling Saul where Saul can find David. So once again, even though they had that big scene just 2 chapters ago about David going, you're more righteous than I, you're going to be the king, all that stuff, we're not sure how much time has passed from that episode to now, but Saul is once again now out to kill David. So he gets word of where David is, he gets intel, and off he goes again. Verse 2, Saul went down to the desert of Ziph with his 3,000 chosen men of Israel to search there for David. Saul made his camp beside the road on the hill of Hachilah, facing Jessamon, but David stayed in the desert. When he saw that Saul had followed him there, he sent out scouts and learned that Saul had definitely arrived. So Saul's got 3,000 men with him to hunt down David's 600 men. When David set out and went to the place where Saul had camped, he saw where Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the commander of the army, had lain down. Remember, we've heard about Abner once before. Back when David killed Goliath, there's a verse that says it says Saul said to Abner, "Who is this kid?" And Abner said, "That's the son of Jesse. That's David." So Abner is Saul's general, the commander of his army. He's also part of Saul's family. He's one of his cousins. So Abner is one of Saul's cousins and the head of his army. And Abner is going to come into play in this story many times in the chapters ahead. Just remember that name. Abner is Saul's general. Saul was lying inside the camp with the army encamped around him. David then asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, who will go down into the camp with me to Saul. Now, again, remember these names. Joab is David's military leader. And down the road, eventually when David becomes king, Joab is going to be his number one man, his general. So remember these two names, Abner and Joab. These are two generals. These are two leaders that we're going to see more of in the chapters ahead. And Joab is brother to a man named Abishai. We're going to hear more about him later. But Saul is camped, and he's in the middle of a big circle of men who are all around him, camped out, and they all bed down for the night. And David says to some of his inner circle of men, "Who's going to go with me down to where Saul is?" Which sounds like a foolish thing. But Abishai says, "I'll go with you." So David and Abishai go down. It says, verse 7, David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. And Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. So, I'm picturing them stepping over, sleeping soldiers, stepping over, tiptoeing till they finally get to the middle of this mass of soldiers in the middle of the night, till they get to the center, and there lies Saul next to his general, Abner. By the way, it mentions that Abner is the son of Ner. The name Abner, Ab, remember, is like Abba, which means father, remember? So Abner means my father is Ner. So Abner, the son of Ner, his name, that's what his name means. It means Ner is my father, and his name is Abner. So they're laying there in the middle of this circle. And it says Saul's spear is right there in the ground next to Saul's head. And Abishai says to David, "Today God's delivered your enemy into your hands. Let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of my spear. I won't strike him twice." In other words, I can run him through in one stroke. It won't take me two. Let me just run him through right now. God has put him in your lap a second time. Because remember, he already had him dead to rights in the cave. Now it's happened again. There's Saul sleeping like a baby. There's a spear right there, and Abishai says, one stroke and we're done. And he's dead. But David said to Abishai, "Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "the Lord himself will strike him. Either his time will come and he'll die, or he'll go into battle and perish. But Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now, get the spear and the water jug that are near his head, and let's go." For the second time, David refuses to kill his enemy. For the second time, Saul is right there, ripe for the killing. And for the second time, someone urges David to just finish it, kill Saul right then. And for the second time, David says, he is still the king. He is still the anointed one. He is still the king. Far be it from me to kill the king. I am not a kingslayer. Regicide is the name for killing a king. I'm not going to commit regicide. He says, but we are going to take his spear and his water jug. They take the spear, they take the water jug, they tiptoe back over, walk over other soldiers, walk to the outside of the perimeter of all these sleeping men. Verse 12 says, David took the spear and the water jug near Saul's head, and they left. No one saw or knew about it, nor did anyone wake up. They were all sleeping because the Lord had put them into a deep sleep. So the author says they're sleeping so soundly that God had something to do with that. The reason nobody wakes up, nobody budges. Verse 17, David crossed over to the other side and stood on top of the hill some distance away, and there was a wide space between them, and he called out to the army, to Abner, the commander of Saul's forces, to Abner, son of Ner, "Aren't you going to answer me, Abner?" Abner replied, "Who are you who calls to the king?" David said, "You're a man, aren't you? And who's like you in Israel? Why didn't you guard your lord the king? Someone came to destroy your lord the king, and what you have done is not good. As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men deserve to die, because you didn't guard your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around you. Where's the king's spear and water jug that were near his head?" So David calls out to Abner and says, "You're not doing your job. You're supposed to be protecting the king. Somebody's supposed to be keeping watch. Not everybody can sleep. Somebody's got to be the night watchman. Somebody's got to stay awake, because if nobody's awake, somebody could come in and kill the king. And guess what? I was this close. Here's Saul's spear. Here's his water jug. I was right there next to you, Abner, and you were snoozing, and you weren't protecting the king. And, you're not doing your job. What kind of man are you? And it says, Saul recognized David's voice and said, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" Notice that's how he talked to him the other time after the cave. He calls him my son. Well, up until recently, he was his son-in-law until Saul married Michal, David's wife, off to somebody else. So ex-son-in-law, I guess. But he says, "Is that you, David, my son?" David replied, "Yes, it is, my lord the king." And he added, "Why is my lord pursuing his servant? What have I done? What wrong am I guilty of? Now, let my lord the king listen to his servant's words." In other words, he's saying, he's still calling himself the servant. He's still saying, "I am your servant, King Saul. If the Lord has incited you against me, then may he accept an offering. If, however, men have done it, may they be cursed before the Lord. They have now driven me from my share in the Lord's inheritance and have said, 'Go serve other gods.' Now, do not let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord. The king of Israel has come out to look for a flea, as one hunts a partridge in the mountains." Once again, he asked the same question that he's asking before, the question that Jonathan asked his father. What have I done to deserve this? What have I done to deserve your wrath? What have I done that you're coming out to try and kill me? Show me where I've been disloyal. Show me where I've done anything to incite a rebellion. Tell me of anything that I've done. He says, if God has led you on this path to kill me, well, then you'll succeed. He says, but if it's just men, if this is a human idea, then it's the wrong idea. And of course, he's being a little bit diplomatic. The idea is not coming from someone other than Saul himself. So he says, tell me what I've done wrong. Tell me what it is that you are coming out here to kill me for. What have I done? And of course, then Saul has a very similar response that he had after the cave incident. He says, verse 21, Saul said, "I have sinned. Come back, David, my son. Because you considered my life precious today, I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have erred greatly." He's, again, has this moment, either a moment of clarity or maybe it's all a lie, but he's like, you're right, you're right, you're right. David says, "Here's the king's spear. Let one of your young men come and get it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord delivered you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. As surely as I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all of my trouble." Anyone reading this, of course, would say, would they say, well, David overthrew Saul. David usurped Saul. If you read this, you're like, no. David didn't usurp him. He didn't rebel against him. He didn't overthrow him. At every turn, he continued to be loyal. Saul said to David, verse 25, "May you be blessed, my son David. You will do great things and surely triumph." So David went on his way and Saul returned home. So once again, we have an episode of Saul having no response to this. David continues to demand of Saul, "Tell me what I did." And Saul has no answer. Saul has no response to that question. So, we keep going now to chapter 27. David has run out of places to hide. Chapter 27, verse 1. David thought to himself, "One of these days, I'll be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I'll slip out of his hand." So David does something he doesn't want to do, and that's finally just leave the territory. Remember what he says, "You've driven me from my inheritance. Don't let my blood fall on foreign soil." Now David says, one of these days he's going to kill me. So I'm going to have to get away and get far enough away that he'll give up this hunt. So once again, he goes back to the Philistines, where you think, these are the people that, you killed their hero, their giant. Now, last time he hung out with the Philistines for a while, he feigned madness. He was drooling and acting like a madman. And this time he comes, and he's got 600 men with him. So he has to go now and basically tell the Philistines, we're mercenaries. Saul is out to kill us. We'll fight for you. You pay us, and we'll be hired guns for you. We'll be mercenaries for you. So that's what he does. He goes to the Philistines and presents himself and his men as hired guns, as hired mercenaries. Verse 2, David and his 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maacah, king of Gath. Remember, same place that Goliath was from, Goliath of Gath. Each man had his family with him, and David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. So Saul gives up the hunt, and David is now at least telling the king of Gath, all right, well, we're turning our backs on Israel. If you pay us or provide for us, we'll fight, we'll serve you. David said to Achish, if I found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, and I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you? So on that day, Achish gave him Ziklag, and it's belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory 1 year and 4 months. So David lives among the Philistines for 16 months, presenting himself and his men as mercenaries. Now, David and his men went up and raided the Gershurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. These are all nomadic tribes who made their living by raiding villages and towns. These were peoples, especially the Amalekites, that's how they got property, by theft, by raiding other people, by raids. And so David starts raiding the raiders. It says, whenever David attacked an area, he didn't leave a man or woman alive. He took the sheep, the cattle, the donkeys, the camels, the clothes, and he returned to Achish. So David is raiding these bandit strongholds, these bandit towns that are made up of enemies who were enemies of both Israel and Philistia. Not everything is just a two-way battle. There's all these different factions, and these raiding companies would raid and pillage Israel as well as the Philistines. So David starts raiding these other peoples. But when he would raid a town, it said he killed everybody. He killed every person. Why? Well, here's why. And when Achish asked, where'd you go raiding today? David would say, against the Negev of Judah, against the Negev of Jerahmeel, against the Negev of the Kenites. In other words, David is saying, I'm raiding Israel. I'm raiding Judah. So David is lying. The Philistines think that David is now totally turned against his own people and is raiding his own people, raiding Judah and Israel. But David, that's what David is telling the Philistines, but that's a lie. David is actually raiding these other people, primarily the Amalekites, because he wants to convince the Philistines that he has burned every bridge between himself and Judah and Israel. He's like, oh yeah, I'm raiding my own people. I'm raiding Judah. So the Philistines will go, well, there's no turning back now. He can't ever go back to their side. And that's why David's telling him this. It's also why David is not leaving anyone alive in these raids. Verse 11, he didn't leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and say, this is what David did. You might think, again, raiding the raiders and killing them is hard for us to swallow as justifiable. But for the author, this is all about, well, he's just killing bad guys. And the Jewish audience would not feel any sympathy for the people that David is killing. They are ancient enemies of the Israelite and Jewish people too. It says, "And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, 'He has become so odious to his people, the Israelites, he'll be my servant forever.'" So David's strategy works. He's convinced the Philistines that there's no going back to Israel, that he has totally alienated himself from his own people. So 2 times now David has run away to live with Philistines, and both times he's used deception. That why he didn't, why the Philistines didn't kill him as soon as they saw him. First time he feigned madness. Second time when he's with all of his men, 600 men, he comes in and pretends to be mercenaries who have now turned against their own people. So one more chapter tonight. And this one, again, has some other pretty strange things in it. Chapter 28. "In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, 'You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army.'" Uh-oh. Up to this point, David has been to just go raiding, come back, bring back plunder, and say, "Oh yeah, I raided a Jewish town today. I raided a town in Judea." Raiding parties. But now the Philistines are saying, "We're going to actually go as an army and fight Israel." And he says to David, "Oh yeah, and you're coming with me, and you're going to fight with my army." And if this was a TV series, this would be like that cliffhanger, and like, uh-oh. How's he going to get out of this one? How's David going to get out of having to go fight against his own people now and be part of the Philistine army? Like, uh-oh. How's he going to trick his way or lie his way or wiggle out of this trap now? David said, then you'll see for yourself what your servant can do. Which is a very non-committal answer if you think about it. Okay, you're going to come fight with us against your own people now. You'll see what we'll do. And they will. Achish said, "Very well, I'll make you my bodyguard for life." Okay, good plan, king of the Philistines, making David your bodyguard. Maybe not the smartest plan, but that's what he's going to do. So, it says, "Now Samuel was dead," 28 verse 3, 1 Samuel 28:3. Samuel was dead. We knew that from a couple of chapters back. Samuel is dead. And all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Samuel, the man who was the leader, the prophet, the priest, the religious spokesperson for God, now has been dead for a while. Saul had expelled the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Mediums and spiritists. When you think of medium, you think of people whose job it was to contact the dead. Seances. People like that, with the crystal ball and all that we think of in movies. That's what a medium was. Somebody who at least claimed to be able to speak to the dead. And that is all banned in Israel. Matter of fact, go back for a minute to Leviticus 20, verse 6. Leviticus 20, verse 6. It says there, this is part of the laws of Leviticus 26. "I will set my face against the person who turns to mediums and spiritists to prostitute himself by following them. I'll cut him off from his people." Okay? Now, jump down in that same chapter, Leviticus 20:27. "A man or woman who is a medium or a spiritist among you must be put to death. You are to stone them. Their blood will be on their own heads." So anyone who's practicing as a medium or a spiritist is to be killed. Then Deuteronomy 18. Deuteronomy 18, starting at verse 10. It says, this is Leviticus 18:10. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord, and because of these detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. So these are some of the practices of some of the pagan people who surrounded the Israelites. People who had sorcery, divination, witchcraft, spell casting, mediums, talking with the dead, all these things. These are strictly forbidden by the laws of Israel. Okay, so just remember that. And it says here in 1 Samuel 28, it reminds us that Saul had expelled the mediums and the spiritists from the land. The Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all the Israelites and set up camp at Gilboa. Okay, so we got the Philistines and the Israelites facing off against each other once again. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Okay, so how in the Old Testament, how did God speak to people? Well, we know in some of the other stories, in dreams. That's how God spoke, back in the time of Joseph. God would sometimes speak in a dream. God is not speaking to Saul in a dream. The Urim is one of these, like the Urim and the Thummim that are mentioned multiple times in the Old Testament. These are things that the priests had that the closest thing that, we don't know for sure exactly what they were. They were some kind of like dice or like a magic 8-ball. You know what I mean? They were, they're asking God, give us a sign, give us an answer, and they'd use these rocks and somehow do it in such a way that they would say that, oh, this is the answer that we've gotten from God. We're not exactly sure what they looked like. They're never really described in detail in the Bible, but we know they were used sometimes to try to divine God's will. And it says that doesn't work either for Saul. And it says he doesn't have a prophet. He doesn't have anybody to speak to the Lord for him. So Saul is, getting ready to face the Philistines, and even though he's been a lousy king, and even though he hasn't listened to Samuel and he hasn't listened to God, he knows that they're in big trouble if they don't have God on their side. So he's looking for some sort of word from the Lord, but God is not speaking to him at all in any methodology. So it says God is not speaking to him in dreams or by the Urim or by the prophets. So Saul said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go and inquire of her." This is, of course, not what you're supposed to do. This is strictly forbidden by Jewish law to go to a medium to hold some kind of seance. That's forbidden. There's one in Endor, they said. There's a witch in Endor. There's a witch in Endor. Okay, total bonus point. What late 60s TV show does this remind you of? Bewitched, because Samantha's mother was named what? Endora. This is why on Bewitched, her mom was named Endora, because of the witch of Endor. Okay? So little trivia things that you're like, oh, okay. You can impress your friends with that one. So it's the witch of Endor. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me," he said, "and bring up for me the one I name." So Saul goes to a medium, or the older translations simply call her a witch, He goes to the witch of Endor and says, I want you to conjure up a spirit of a dead person for me. But the woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death? In other words, she's like, you know what you're asking me is illegal. You know the king has said that anybody who practices this, trying to speak to the dead stuff, it's punishable by death. Why are you trying to get me to do something that is strictly forbidden? Who told you I was a witch, Who told you I was a medium? I don't know what you're talking about. Saul swore to her by the Lord, as surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this. The woman asked, who shall I bring up for you? Bring up Samuel, he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. So she sees through his disguise. She sees that he is actually the king in disguise who has come to her to get her to do something that he himself has strictly forbidden and declared to be punishable by death. And now Saul is asking her to somehow communicate with the dead, specifically with the prophet Samuel. Now, at this point, as we go on, you might say, all right, now, because what we're going to see is she at least appears to say, you've seen movies where the medium says, oh, he says this and he says that and blah, 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 and speaks, and the dead person is talking through me. The Bible doesn't make it clear, really, if she's a phony, if she's using some sort of demonic or, evil presence to do this, or if in this situation, God is actually using her to deliver a message that Saul is supposed to hear. And it's not totally clear which of those is she a phony? Is she just making it up? Is there some sort of evil spirit involved here? Is God actually allowing her to speak a prophetic word in the name of Samuel? It's not really clear which of those is happening here, because it appears at least that Samuel speaks. So it says, the king says to her, don't be afraid. What do you see? Let me read this little note that's in my Bible. It says, consulting a medium or a spiritist was forbidden, as Saul knew well. Earlier, he had banned mediums in the kingdom. But through his disobedience, Saul had lost contact with God and was desperate to know the future. Whether Samuel actually appeared or whether the woman faked it, the results were the same. Saul left more fearful than when he came. So, at least my Bible is saying, we don't know. Was she faking it, or was this something authentic? So, Saul says, don't be afraid, what do you see? The woman said, I see a spirit coming up out of the ground. What's he look like? An old man wearing a robe is coming up, she said. And Saul knew it was Samuel. And at that point I think, wait a minute, an old man in a robe? Wouldn't that describe like half of the men who died? An old man in a robe? It would be like, well, what do you look like? Well, he was old and he wore clothes. Oh, yeah, him. I don't know why an old man in a robe is automatically, that must be Samuel. But she says, I see an old man in a robe. Well, that's him, that's Samuel. Saul knew it was Samuel. He bowed down, prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? I'm in great distress, Saul said. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God's turned away from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams, so I've called on you to tell me what to do. So Saul's desperate here. I don't know what to do. The Philistines are there. I don't know what to do. And Samuel, or the voice of Samuel, or the medium, or Samuel said, why do you consult me now that the Lord's turned away from you and become your enemy? The Lord's done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also hand over the army of Israel to the Philistines. Immediately, Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and night. So the message here from Samuel is, you turned your back on God, and he's now turned his back on you. You didn't listen to him. You didn't listen to me. And tomorrow, when you go into battle, you and your sons are all going to be where I am. And that's the message. And the whole army is going to fall before the Philistines. And Saul is just, he kind of falls to the ground in shock and fear from that. When the woman came to Saul and saw that he was greatly shaken, she said, "Look, your maidservant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant. Let me give you some food so you may eat and have the strength to go on your way." She's like reminding him, now, what I did was illegal, but you're the king and you made me do it, and I did what you asked me, and why don't you eat something so you can leave, so you can go and get away from me now. But he refused and said, "I will not eat." But his men joined the woman in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the couch. The woman had a fatted calf at her house, which she butchered at once, and she took some flour, kneaded it, and baked bread without yeast, and she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. And that same night, they got up and left. So, eat something is not quite like, I got something in the fridge, here, have some bologna. I mean, she had to, she had to kill, it says she had to kill a calf, and she had to make bread, and, this is going to take a while to do all of that. But she makes food for them, and Saul finally eats, and he goes off, and he has just heard his death sentence. He's just heard, tomorrow you're going to die. Tomorrow all your sons are going to die. Tomorrow your whole army is going to be defeated. That's what's happening to you tomorrow. And so Saul is thoroughly drained. And so we set up what's now going to happen tomorrow. Because on the one side, we've got the Philistine army, which includes David and his men, at least supposedly. David and his men had now been co-opted into the Philistine army. David has been telling lies to the king of Gath, has been telling him, "Oh yeah, I've been raiding Judah all the time. I've been taking plunder from Judah," when he hasn't been. He hasn't been fighting against his own people. But the king of the Philistines thinks that he has, and he's now expecting David and all of his men to go into battle against Israel. That's what's happening on one side of the equation. On the other side of the equation, we have Saul and his men who have just been told, "You're going to lose tomorrow. You're going to die tomorrow." And that's what's going to happen in the battle tomorrow. So these are the two, you can imagine both of these, what is David thinking the night before the battle? What is Saul thinking the night before the battle? And that's where we are going to leave it. So you'll come back next week. That's what's going to happen to these two men as we near the end of this cat and mouse situation between David and Saul. As we're almost at the end of the conflict and the back and forth between these two men. We only have 2 more chapters of 1 Samuel, but of course the story goes all the way through 2 Samuel too. But that's where I'm going to end for now. So let's have a word of prayer. Lord, these stories fill us with interest, but also, Lord, we learn so many lessons. We learn that even men like David who followed you were prone to sometimes making rash decisions, just like we are. We learn that listening to you is what we all need to do. And when we fail to listen to you, we get in trouble. Lord, we learn that you were involved in this nation of Israel, and that when the people listened to you, things went well, and when the people failed to listen to you, things didn't. And Lord, we know that's true in our lives too. When we listen to you, things go well. When we don't listen to you, things tend to go in a bad way. So help us to listen to you. Help us to ask ourselves what you're calling us to do, and help us to learn lessons from these people who were not perfect, but who are part of this great saga of how you chose this one nation to give birth to the message that would eventually find its completion in Jesus. This ancestor David, who would one day, that his descendant, the son of David, Jesus, would come to show us a new way and a better way and a new covenant. And we trust in him, and we put our lives in his hands. And we thank you that we live on this side of the cross, that we live on this side of the resurrection. Amen. Thanks, folks. Online. Good to see you. See you next week.